like to welcome everyone back to CORT 2023. It's our third annual conference on religious trauma. And I'm so delighted to introduce the final speaker of our opening night, Dr. Danielle Kramer. Is a certified sex therapist and board-certified clinical sexologist who splits their time between clinical practice, research, and consulting. Dr. Kramer was raised in purity culture and devotes a significant amount of their practice to working with religious and sexual trauma, as well as being the only certified sex therapist in the Florida Panhandle providing gender-affirming care. That's so amazing. Dr. Kramer's talk tonight is on toxic purity, unpacking the patriarchy, understanding the foundations of gender oppression in religion and beyond. I'm so glad you're here tonight. Welcome, Dr. Kramer.
Thanks for having me, Janice. Thanks, everyone, for being here. So am I good to go, Janice? Awesome. So I'm going to share my screen with y'all. I do a super interactive presentation. I'm used to teaching in academic settings, so I like to ask for a lot of participation from folks. Y'all are welcome to participate as much as you'd like to or not. That's totally up for you. I'm going to do it in the chat, and then I'll also have QR codes for y'all to scan. If anyone's got their phone or something on them and they want to scan a QR code, you can participate in the discussion kind of live as we go. I'm a researcher, like Janice said, so we'll be doing some like live data tonight, and y'all will be able to see this sort of interactively as we go. It's not peer-reviewed research or anything like that. We don't have the IRB here, but we'll at least get some data going. I like to have an idea of kind of who I have hanging out with me tonight, because then I can speak more specifically to what y'all are looking for or what people need. So if I can have like anything that y'all are comfortable sharing in the chat. I would love to know if I have, do I have any therapists in the room? If I have any therapists in the room or any coaches in the room, if you could check in the chat and just be like, I'm a therapist, I'm a coach. If I have anyone that's clergy or like a religious leader in the room, I would love to know that. If I have anyone that is recovering from religious trauma, I'm sure that I will have like everyone that's like, yep, definitely me. Love to know that. I won't be speaking super specifically to any religion here tonight. So I'll give you that kind of caveat. There will be no specific religions talked about. We're going to talk about kind of an overarching of gender oppression. Now, when I give this talk, I told Janice, I'm like, this is literally a semester-long conversation that I'm condensing into an hour. So we could have whole philosophical discussions on what I'm going to talk about tonight. Unfortunately, we don't have time. I only have an hour. But if y'all have questions, by all means, put them in the chat. I know Sue's going to be watching too. I'll try to answer them as best I can as I go. If I don't, keep them for the end. I will definitely give you all at least 10 minutes at the end for Q&A. Okay? I'm going to start sharing my screen here, and we will get going. Y'all will have me share my screen back and forth a couple of times tonight. All right, good to go. Y'all are seeing the PowerPoint, right? All right, so we're going to be talking about unpacking patriarchy tonight. That's what y'all came here for. If anyone was like, oh, that's not what I thought I was getting into, that's what we're getting into. So we're going to talk about the basics of gender oppression. My specialty is within the US. I was just telling Janice, I always like to give people a little bit of a rundown of my identities. I'm queer, I'm kinky, I'm poly. Like Janice said, I'm a certified clinical sexologist. That means I study human sexuality for a living. I'm a researcher, but I'm also a certified sex therapist. So I do part-time research, part-time clinical work. My research area specifically is misogyny in the US. There's a whole lot of crossover from other cultures. This is specifically misogyny in the US. If y'all wanted to talk about misogyny outside of the US, I could probably have an individual discussion about certain different areas. I have traveled throughout Latin America studying misogyny and a couple places in Europe. I lived in Asia for a little while, so we could have that discussion at another time. But this one's specifically going to be on misogyny in the US. So the first thing I'm going to have y'all do is participate in this discussion. So if anyone wants to scan this QR code, you're going to pop up with a question. I want you to answer this as best you can with one-word answers. It's going to ask you a question. Give me one-word answers. So when you scan the little QR code, there should be something that pops up. It's like a blue screen or something like that. I'm going to end my share screen really quick and pop y'all over so you can see the research pop up in real time. If you scan this QR code and you answer the questions, I'll show you what this data looks like. And if y'all are looking at that question and you're like, I need a little more direction, give me 1 second and I'll give it to you. So I want y'all to give me some terms, some things that we might call men when we are insulting them. One of the things that always comes up to my mind whenever I think about this, and also y'all, I have ADHD, so I'm going to shift around like chronically and constantly. Please get comfortable for this conversation. Like sit however you need to sit because you are going to watch me like shift. So the thing that always comes up in my head is if anyone saw The Sandlot when they were a kid, that was very much like a movie of my childhood. And I can't remember what character is in it, but there's a character in there that goes, you play ball like a girl. And that's what I always think of when I think of like, what do we call men when we insult them? So y'all should be able to see this on your screen, right? You're seeing a bunch of dirty words pop up. I do not have the dirty word filter on, so you can put whatever you want in there. But this is what we call a word cloud. So in research, when we're asking people to fill out surveys and we're asking them to give us 1 or maybe 1 to 2 word answers, we can put it in what we call a word cloud. The most answered word is the biggest. The least answered words are the smallest. So if y'all see in this word cloud right now, pussy comes up really, really big. We've got lazy in there. That's one that comes up. Animalistic, it's a great one. We have coward, bastard, dick, gay, ego. I'll even take like egotistical, a prick, brutal. So these are some things that we think about men. So I want us to keep this in mind. We're going to switch back to our lovely PowerPoint. All this tech, y'all, like switching back and forth. We're also happy that I can actually do this. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're all going to get on the same page. I can't give a lecture or discussion to y'all unless we're talking about the same definitions, right? So the first thing we're going to talk about is patriarchy. Most people here have heard this term before. So I think it's really important that we discuss what patriarchy is and what it isn't. So the first thing you have on your screen is kind of a standard dictionary definition of patriarchy. I want y'all to think about what dictionary definitions give us, though. They give us really simplistic, succinct definitions for words. They are not meant to contain a complete representation of how those words actually function in real life, in real time. They don't contain context or nuance, and they don't contain depth. Dictionary definitions are not meant to give us an unambiguous answer to the entirety of how we can use a single word, right? That's a lot of pressure for a dictionary. And that's not how this works. So that's our dictionary definition. I also want to make it super clear that when we talk about patriarchy, we are not talking about men. Those are not the same thing. So often when I speak about this topic, people have a lot of feelings about this, and y'all are going to have a lot of feelings during this presentation. A lot of things that kind of commonly come up for people during presentations like this are like rage, anger, all super valid, right? All of these things are okay. People have uncomfortable feelings, like they're like, oh, have I participated in this? Don't worry, we all have. And also we're unpacking it today, right? So we'll talk about that, the fact that none of us escape it. But I want to be super clear that when I say patriarchy, I do not mean men. When I offer patriarchy as an explanation for a social phenomenon that's happening, I don't mean men. I'm not blaming men. I'm blaming a social structure, right? So men and patriarchy are not interchangeable. One is a power structure that harms all genders and all people, but especially women and marginalized genders. And the other is men, right? Like the other are like the humans that we love and we know in our real lives. So they're not the same thing. So this is a more expansive definition of patriarchy. This is from the Encyclopedia of Violence and Peace. We're going to go over it bit by bit, so don't worry about memorizing it at the moment. So the first thing you'll notice is that it produces gendered and intersectional inequalities. What does that mean? We all know what gendered means. Intersectional inequalities means it intersects with other identities: race, class, sexual orientation, sex assigned at birth. So this creates intersectional inequalities. I have a whole other lecture about how this intersects with race. I have a whole other lecture about how this intersects with LGBTQ identities. So we only got an hour, but just know that that's how these intersections work. We're not going to cover them today. Y'all can ask questions about them. By all means, I encourage it, and I will try my best to answer them in the time frame that we have. But for right now, we're going to focus on just the gendered inequalities, right? But I need y'all to know that those intersections happen. Whoop. Okay, never mind. I was a little ahead of myself, but we got it. So the other thing we want is look at these three words down here: govern, oppress, exploit. We're going to go over that. So govern. I got your definition down here at the bottom, in case y'all need to refer back to it. So we have abortion laws that govern female bodies. Regardless of how you feel about those abortion laws personally, they govern female bodies and they do not govern male bodies. So we do have laws that restrict female bodies that we don't have that restrict male bodies. We have laws restricting gender affirming care, not just for kids, but I'm licensed in Florida. Right now, they restrict them for adults in Florida. I want to be really clear about what I say next, because we're not going to get into a big debate. That's a whole nother class, y'all. But this is not explicit support for or against teenagers having gender affirming surgeries. It's not a judgment on this one way or another. But what I am saying is that thousands of teenage boys per year have surgery for something that we call gynecomastia, which is the removal of breast tissue, because it causes them emotional stress and discomfort. The same can be said for thousands of teenage girls who receive breast implants. And this is cisgender. For those that don't know cisgender, it means the sex that you're assigned at birth matches your gender identity. So if you're AFAB, assigned female at birth, and you identify as a woman, that would be cisgender, right? So we're talking about cisgender teenagers having surgery. No one is policing their bodies. No one is policing teenage boys having surgery for gynecomastia because it causes them emotional distress, right? So we do have those laws that govern LGBTQ bodies that we don't have in other places, right? The issue isn't gender affirming care then, right? The issue is governing and oppressing LGBTQ people. If we don't govern male bodies or female bodies in the same way, or we don't govern male bodies in the same way we govern female, and we don't govern cis bodies in the same way that we govern trans bodies, but the same surgeries are happening, we have to question what that real issue is, right? Now we're on to the oppression piece of it. Really quick before I go there, does anyone know what the one law is in the United States? And I know that like most y'all are located in Canada, but what is the one law that we have in the United States that actually governs male bodies? And I don't know if y'all have it in Canada, I'll be totally honest. But does anyone know what the singular law is that we have in the US that actually does govern male bodies, their bodily autonomy? When we're talking about challenging bodily autonomy, we have one law that does govern male bodily autonomy. Does anyone know what it is? It's the selective service. It's the draft. Someone said conscription. So it's the selective service, it's the draft, which hasn't been used in the US since like the 1970s, y'all. But that is the one law that we have in the United States that does govern male bodies. So if you have a draft and it says the men have to enlist in the draft, or males have to enlist in the draft, I think is the way that it's written. And females do not have to enlist in the draft. That is a law that governs bodily autonomy. And I just want to make it clear that I'm against the draft too, just so we're all congruent, right? So then we have oppress. Again, I want to make it clear that patriarchy does not equal men. When we talk about oppression, men commit the vast majority of violent crimes in our society. This includes rape, sexual assault, burglary, domestic violence, general assaults. 72% of women report taking a different transportation home due to harassment on their way home. 85% of women in North America have experienced street harassment by the age of 17. And I like to make that one really clear, 85%. And the way that it's written in research, I want y'all to notice that 85% of women have experienced sexual harassment before the age of 17. That means that they were girls, right? Before the age of 17, we're talking about children. So that means the vast majority of those that are raised and socialized in women in our society have experienced sexual harassment before their 17th birthday. That's the threat of male violence that we all live under every day. Now, a lot of people will say men are more likely to be victims of a violent crime than women. Those are also men perpetrating it, right? So I like to remind people that the same violence that we like to teach men and boys are inherent to their character. Men are inherently violent, they're inherently aggressive, right? That's the same violence that keeps you up at night worrying about your daughters. It's not different. This stuff does not occur in a vacuum, right? And then we also have things like the wage gap, the glass ceiling, the gender pay gap, right? Which brings us to exploitation. Women are still doing the bulk of household and childcare labor. This is true even in marriages, what we call in the research as equitable marriages. In research, equitable marriage solely refers to earning potential. It refers to I, as a woman, am earning the same amount as my male partner, right? So when we look at what we call equitable relationships, both people are earning the same. Wives still do more than double the hours of housework as their husbands do. And I could look at the data, but I think the husbands came up to like 1.6 hours and the women came up to like 4.2 or something like that. So it's quite a bit of difference. And if we added up all of women's unpaid labor on household and care tasks, it would equal 1.5 trillion with a T, $1.5 trillion per year. It's a lot of money, y'all. It's a lot of money. And no one's saying that no one else works hard, right? We're purely talking about unpaid domestic labor here. So that's where some of that exploitation comes from. This is Bell Hooks. If anyone's never heard of Bell Hooks, I highly encourage you to check her out. Absolutely amazing. She's an incredible feminist writer. I highly, highly recommend her. There's a couple of her books here. The Will to Change is the book that's down here. You kind of see it's a little bit cut off. It says Men, Masculinity, and Love. Absolutely incredible book. Adore that book. I quote it probably once a week in classes. We're going to go over this definition a little bit too. So you'll notice in her definition, men are inherently dominating to those who are considered weak. Who's considered weak? Usually women or females, or we can even change this to anything that is deemed feminine, right? A degrading of things that are feminine. So if you take it as a degrading of things that are feminine, we're also going to degrade usually gay men, right? Any men that's appearing feminine or weak could potentially be seen as gay. And if y'all grew up in religious areas like I did, right, that was one of the worst possible things you could be seen as a man. You don't want anyone to call you gay or think that you're gay, right? So homophobia, remember those intersections? Homophobia links into this perfectly because we're degrading things that are feminine. And then we'll see psychological terrorism and violence. We already touched on the violent part of it a second ago, but let's talk about psychological terrorism because I bring this up and a lot of times people are like, oh, that seems like a lot, right? Like that's a little bit extreme. But I want you to think about how much, did anyone grow up in purity culture? Like in the chat, right? We're here on religious trauma. If we grew up in purity culture, I want you to think about how much purity culture gaslights you. I want you to think about how it victim blames you, how it misinforms you about stuff, about your sex, about sexuality, about who you are as a person. We know that there's a lot of misinformation in purity culture. I want you to think about some of the inaccurate things that you were taught about sex and bodies. That's psychological terrorism, right? If you were queer and you grew up in purity culture, that's psychological terrorism, right? Like living under this compulsory heterosexuality. Sexual harassment, that's a form of psychological terrorism. It's the constant threat that men are always watching you, that you're a sexual body, that you could be a stumbling block, that you're seen as an object, right? We have microaggressions. Those are a form of psychological terrorism. Those are those teeny tiny little things that like you can't quite put your finger on it, but you know that they feel icky. You were being talked down to, right? You were being seen as less than, but you can't quite put your finger on it. And then we have misogyny, which is my research area of expertise. Y'all can build an entire career on misogyny in case you were curious. And we're going to talk about that. It's my favorite topic, which is so weird, but it is. So misogyny is often misunderstood. Most people think that misogyny is the hatred of women. But again, that's a super simplistic dictionary definition, right? And I didn't go get a whole PhD on one singular dictionary definition. I promise I didn't. So it's obviously a lot bigger and more expansive than that, right? So remember what we said about dictionary definitions. Those basic definitions, they don't give us enough context and enough understanding of how this actually plays out in real life. So instead, I want you to start thinking about misogyny as the law enforcement arm of patriarchy. It shames people back into the stereotypical boxes for man and woman. Patriarchy is deployed to keep people in line, to put you back into those boxes. Sorry, I think I said patriarchy, but I meant misogyny. So misogyny is deployed. It's patriarchy's law enforcement arm. Patriarchy is the system. Misogyny is the law enforcement that goes out to police it, right? This is what I was talking about earlier, y'all. Nobody escapes this. Patriarchy is endemic to our culture. We're all responsible for unpacking this system. When women impose misogyny, so I often get this like pushback a little bit, right? People be like, well, women can be the worst about this. Absolutely. We call that internalized misogyny. We say you've internalized the messages about how you should be policed and controlled as a female body, right? And now you are imparting those on other women. You have now become the law enforcement arm. And guess what? Patriarchy works best when it doesn't have to do the work, when it has women out there doing the work for it. So it can just kind of sit back and chill, right? It needs women to keep it going. It can't keep going with just men alone. So the feminist scholar Mona Eltahawy, if anyone's ever heard of her, absolutely highly recommend her. She says patriarchy is so universal and normalized in our culture that it's like asking a fish, what is water? If y'all think about purity culture in the same way, it's like asking a fish, what is water? We're so submerged in it. We might be taught purity culture and submerged in it from the time we are so young that we're just a fish swimming in water. We hardly even recognize it anymore. And no one's told us anything different, right? So we're just swimming through it. And sometimes it's not until you start unpacking it. A lot of us started our deconstruction journey. Something sparked that, right? That's that moment that you're that fish and you're going, oh shit, y'all, I'm swimming in water. And I think this water is poisoned and it's icky, actually, right? So it's everywhere. And it's important to know that misogyny is enabled and protected in our culture. It upholds the social norms by patrolling and policing them. Y'all can see this little triangle that we have on the side. You're going to see other triangles like this later on. If you've never seen the purity culture triangle and you've never seen the rape culture triangle, we're going to talk about it. But the behaviors at the bottom protect and enable the behaviors at the top. So you'll see we've got sexist, homophobic, transphobic jokes, problematic language, objectification. That stuff People say, oh, it's just a joke, right? Just laugh at it. It's just a joke. That stuff enables the stuff at the top, right? That's how we get rape culture. That's how we normalize sexual harassment, right? So when you consider misogyny being enabled and protected, I want you to consider how common it is for us to call women sluts, whores, for us to joke and call a man a fag, right? Like, oh, you're being such a fag. Why? Why are those? That's very gendered language, right? Because we're swimming in it, right? We're fish swimming in it. It's so normalized. Remember what I said, 85% of women have experienced sexual harassment before the age of 17. Look at that. We're already up there in the purple. Look at this pyramid. We've bypassed the teal on the bottom. Everyone experienced that stuff before they were 17, right? Everyone heard a sexist joke, a homophobic joke. Everyone heard problematic language before 17, probably. Traditional gender roles. We were all exposed to traditional gender roles before the age of 17, I think. We've already hit that purple middle line of the pyramid, at least for the majority of women, before they hit their 17th birthday. This is not a small problem. Sometimes it's really easy for folks to confuse sexism and misogyny. A lot of my students confuse that. The easiest way I can explain this for folks is that sexism justifies these norms. Misogyny patrols, polices, and upholds them. Sexism justifies it. Misogyny patrols, polices, and upholds them. And you're going to see that later in this presentation. If that doesn't quite make sense to you yet, I hope it will before the end of this. So I want you all to think about what are some things your religion taught you that women were. What are some words that we think of when women come to mind? I'm going to give you all another QR code to scan. These can be positive or negative. I encourage you to put in both if you were taught both things. Here's your little QR code. I'll give you the output in a second. If you feel like you were taught conflicting messages, if you feel like you were taught that women were these loving nurturers, but also stumbling blocks, I want you to give me both of these. I want you to give me everything. Scan the QR code. I'll give everyone a second to get it. And then we'll flip over to the research and I'll show you all what that looks like. All right, I'm going to flip. Y'all can see the results here, hopefully. We've got a lot of stuff. We've got a nag. Ooh, I love that one. Nag. Such gendered language, y'all. Men are never nags. Notice. Subservient, patient, a young lady. You always have to be a lady, right? Everyone always has to be a lady. Submissive. They're wise. They're quiet. A temptress. Ooh, withholding. That's a great one. A helpmeet. That's always a very popular one. So we see that we've got a couple different, some of these are kind of competing, right? Wise, first nagging, a Madonna. Love that one. That one's going to come up in a little bit, y'all. So we've got a couple different words to describe women. We're going to flip back. All right. So I want y'all to think of this pyramid and think of the term misogyny when you think of those words that you just saw on the screen, right? Because I think we have like temptress on there, all that good stuff. So this is the representation of what we're going to be looking at for the rest of this time, y'all. We're going to be looking at ambivalent sexism theory. Take a good look at this. I have credited the original researchers down in the corner. And now I'm going to mess it up because I like this better. So I created this myself. This is what I teach off of. The researchers are fine with it. I promise. I've asked them about it. I think this is a lot better way to kind of follow the flow for it. So I promise you're going to understand this by the end. This is the general baseline for gender oppression in our society. This is the general theory that kind of encompasses it all. If you can understand this, you can unpack a lot of the misogyny that you see in the US today and in Canada, really anywhere. This applies basically anywhere in the world. This is what we call ambivalent sexism theory. What I need you to know about this system, it is heterosexist. Everybody is heterosexual here. Nobody is gay. They don't exist. Trans people don't exist. It's homophobic. It's transphobic. It erases all gender diversity. Okay. Everyone falls into male, female, and those correspond with man, woman, right? Everybody's heterosexual. There's no options here. There's really no such thing as intersex either. Pretty much recognizes that they exist, but everyone's got to fall into these nice little categories, right? So we're going to start with ambivalent sexism. So I want you all to go back to those survey results that we just talked about. Did they seem ambivalent? Some of them were hostile, right? Some of them were positive, like a wife, a mother. A hen could be a positive or negative. I'm not sure how I could take that. I've seen it both, right? Submissive, someone could see that as positive or negative. I guess it depends on how you look at it, right? In the sex therapy world, it can definitely be a positive thing. But we had some ambivalent results. The results were not all positive or all negative, right? They were pretty ambivalent. That's what ambivalent sexism is. If I were to give it to you in like a nice little capsule and I was going to package it up in a nice little box, I would tell you that ambivalent sexism essentially occurs because the patriarchies tells men that they need sex, they need childbearers, and they need caregivers. And that interrupts their need of dominance of women. Men have a need for aggression and dominance of those lesser than them, but they also need them, right? They're intimately, what we call intimate interdependence. It's really important to note that this is not men's innate nature, right? We have been taught that this is men's innate nature. If you really look at it in the research, there's this really famous saying in gender research, there's a lot more difference within sex and gender than there is across sex and gender. So if we look at the study of men, there's a lot more difference in how men show up in personalities and their expressions and their likes and dislikes. Same thing with women, same thing with gender diverse people. There's a lot more diversity within the groups than between the groups. But what we've been taught is that a lot of this stuff is in innate nature. It's due to testosterone. It's due to hormones, right? What we're really finding is that our social conditioning can change the way that our brain operates. So that's something new that we're looking at in neuroscience. And that's probably a whole nother presentation, y'all. But we do know that a lot of this comes from social conditioning. Patriarchy creates this ambivalence with this conflicting messages that women are weaker and less than, and being like them is disgusting. If you don't believe me that being like them is disgusting, why were so many of those words that we use to put men down feminine, what we call feminine coded words? A pussy, a bitch, a fag. Those are putting men down by calling them feminine, right? It's what we call gendered language or gendered insults. We almost always put men down by calling them women. And there's a reason for that, because they're seen as less than, right? So that's basically what I just told y'all, right? Seen as less than. Someone brought up Madonna. This is where that Madonna whore complex happens between hostile and benevolent sexism. This is that split. We have ambivalent. The Madonna goes to benevolent sexism. The whore goes to hostile sexism. And we're going to talk about it. So hostile sexism is a lot more easily identified for most people. It's very openly misogynistic. It's what the average person would see as like very sexist, right? It's characterized by more antisocial views of women. Benevolent sexism is more pro-social views. Hostile sexism sees women as bad, disgusting. Benevolent sexism tends to see women as like mothers and nurturers, right? If anyone knows about Andrew Tate, who Andrew Tate is, he was really big on social media the last, 1 to 2 years. Has anyone heard of the Sneeko upheaval? He was related to Andrew Tate. These are kind of like the podcast bros. I study misogyny in the US, y'all. Sometimes I have a skewed view of who people actually know, right? Because these are misogyny bigwigs that we study. These guys are what we would call hostile sexism. They're the manosphere guys, the red pill men, the incel men. It's street harassment, rape culture. A lot of hostile sexism happens in online communities, Reddit, podcasts, things like that. It's really important to remember that hostile sexism is used to punish women who are seen as challenging or trying to steal men's power or dominance. That is the goal of hostile sexism. That's its role. It punishes women who are seen as challenging or trying to steal men's dominance and power. And it punishes them by using misogyny to put them back in line, right? Hostile sexism represents a significant danger to women and all people in society. A lot of our mass shootings in the US, it's a very US problem, y'all. It's a very US unique problem. A lot of those have happened by men from the manosphere. A lot of those have happened by incel culture or men that had really heavy misogynistic views. Things like a lot of serial rapists, a lot of them were online in some of these Reddit communities. And we can go back and we can view their previous posts. In my research, we have coding systems that search for certain word captures and stuff like that, right? So we can capture a lot of this really hostile sexism and the things that men are saying about women online. This stuff is dangerous. It doesn't occur in a vacuum. I'm ahead of myself, but y'all see it. Also, a lot of LGBTQ hate crimes heavily linked to hostile sexism, right? A lot of that stuff is, I want y'all to notice that when we have a lot of transphobia, it's often directed towards trans women. Very rarely is it directed towards trans men, or at least less so. When we're talking about bathrooms, we usually target trans women, right? This is due to hostile sexism. We can't stand men stepping outside what we see as their gendered role. We're a lot more tolerant of it when women do. It's a little funny meme. I'm usually teaching students, y'all, so remember, I got to keep them up. I got to keep them going. But you'll see this is hostile sexism. Hostile sexism occurs when men say, oh, well, women like it. When we treat them like this, it's chivalry when they like it, but it's sexism when they don't, right? This is talking about benevolent sexism. Chivalry is benevolent sexism. Hostile sexism is used to punish you when you're not appreciative of the benevolent. This is my dog. This is him grumpy in the morning. Thought it was funny to put on the hostile slide. This is what he looks like. It's a French bulldog when you wake him up really early in the morning. If anyone was curious how we measure hostile sexism in the research, this is a little screenshot of some of the metrics that we use, some of the questions that we asked. The R at the end of it means reverse. It means it's reverse. It's a reverse question. So feminists are making reasonable demands on men. People who hold hostile sexist beliefs would disagree with that, right? So these are some of the questions that we ask in research to measure how many people or how heavy someone's hostile sexism views go. This is for people of all genders. I want to be clear that we don't just research men on this. We've looked at and seen how women feel about this. For my gender diverse folks, we don't have good research on that yet. We still are wholly lacking in research on gender diverse folks. So now we're going to talk about benevolent sexism. This is the one that gets people a little bit riled up, y'all. So take a deep breath. We will all get through it together. This is the one that people are usually like, but it's a good thing, right? So benevolent sexism often goes super unnoticed. It's preached really heavily in churches. It's preached really heavily from the pulpit. It's a lot more palatable than hostile sexism. So it skates under the radar because it's not hostile. It actually sounds like you believe good things about women. It sounds like you love women. It sounds like you want to protect women. You know you're experiencing benevolent sexism when a man or anyone says something seemingly nice, but it's based on traditional gender stereotypes. It's often deployed with really good intentions, though. So things like, oh, well, women are just naturally nurturers. They're just naturally better. That's benevolent sexism. Women aren't natural caregivers. They're not natural nurturers. Some are. So are some men, right? So are a lot of gender diverse folks. It doesn't have so much to do with your sex assigned at birth, so much as it does the gender that you were sociologically constructed to be a part of. It sounds super nice, right? But it contributes just as much to oppression because it keeps women in spaces that are beneath men. It assumes that all women have the same desires and goals to be wives, mothers, caregivers, to get a man, find a man, win his marriage proposal, right? If you grew up in purity culture, that was like the peak. Find a man, win the proposal, get married, have children. And if you weren't married by the time you were like 25, you're like a spinster, y'all. You're just a spinster. Also gendered language, right? So benevolent sexism really keeps women in their place. It ultimately limits women's roles and their ambitions. And we find in the research, in a lot of ways, that everything occurs on a spectrum. The more conservative and fundamentalist and traditional your religion is, right, the less likely women in those religions are to meet certain metrics of success. Things like graduating high school, right? Things like those women tend to have poor health outcomes because they're caring for their family and they're caring for everybody else, but they tend to not care so much for themselves. We see high levels of depression. We really romanticize this idea of a woman giving up everything and giving up herself as long as she has a wife and a family, right? Notice how many, and this is, again, this is just general, but notice how many male-coded activities are time away from the home, like golfing, fishing, and they take a lot of time. Female-coded activities, things like knitting, baking, cooking, those occur in the home, and they're more caretaking tasks. Anybody can have these hobbies, right? But I want you to notice how those gendered lines have tended to fall out in our society. That's benevolent sexism. It limits women's interest. It limits their free time and their ability to develop themselves. Now, remember I said hostile sexism is used to punish women or anyone who steps out of line in a patriarchy, right? By deploying misogyny. So benevolent sexism then is used to reward women who reinforce the gender stereotypes of serving men as wives, mothers, and romantic objects. Hostile sexism is used to punish you and put you back in line. Benevolent sexism is used to reward you. So then we have people that come to me and they say, well, what about these women, right, that stand next to these men that promote things that are not for women's rights, right? Or they stand next to men that promote misogynist ideas. Well, they're getting that benevolent sexism. They're betraying it in order to get that reward, promise of protection and providing. I'll protect you and I'll provide for you if you're a good woman. But I want you to notice how quickly that protection and that providing gets whipped away. If you're a slut, if you're a whore, what were you wearing? Were you drinking? For those of us that were raised in purity culture, the victim blaming that comes along with it, you weren't a good woman, so you got what you deserved. And notice how black and white that is. Other people get to tell you if you're a good woman. You don't get to determine that. They do. And if they determine you're not a good enough woman, hostile sexism is going to put you right back in line, right? That protection and providing will get taken away as soon as you are not fulfilling the goals of patriarchy, as soon as you step out of line. So benevolent sexism can be just as harmful as hostile sexism. Here's the attitudes. Remember, I said sexism justifies it, misogyny upholds it. It's not the best picture, y'all. I did the best I could. It's a little bit blurry, but you'll see the attitude is reverence of women as a wife and a mother. If we put women on a pedestal, that's benevolent sexism, right? If we revere them as these caretakers, but the idea behind that is because women shouldn't deviate from traditional roles. Women belong in the home. It sounds so nice and good, right? Put women on a pedestal as these amazing caretakers, but ultimately it serves to limit them. Men have a duty to protect women. Who are they protecting us from? Where else does someone get to be the problem and the solution? Does anyone else think of anything in life where someone gets to be the problem and the solution? We're going to create a problem and then sell you the solution, right? That's like pyramid scheme stuff. But the flip of this is, well, why do women need to protect women? Because they're weak. And because there's dangerous men out there that will hurt you if you're not a good enough woman, right? Romanticizing women as objects of heterosexual attention. I mean, that's because they should be idealized for their purity, right? And their sexuality. So this is our measuring benevolent sexism scale, right? These are some of the questions that we asked. This is a little bit of a difference between hostile and benevolent sexism. Hostile sexism, men think that women are out there to use them. They're seductresses, right? It's a hostile view. Benevolent sexism, we put them up on a pedestal. These are some more questions that we have between benevolent and hostile sexism. I did promise I would give y'all around 10 minutes per question, so I'll click through these next few a little bit quick. This looks super confusing. I promise it's not. I promise I can get you to understand it. It's not that bad. This is essentially a model for hostile and benevolent sexism that illustrates why benevolent sexism is harmful. The model outlines what could be described as career versus family trade-off, essentially. Benevolent sexism is harmful because women focus more on men than on themselves. They trade off for family, right? They focus on the men's career, the men's achievement. And then the men achieve higher influence, right? The men have higher relationship satisfaction, but the women have lower confidence, lower self-efficacy, right? They have lower belief that they can do certain things. And it puts them in a vulnerable space in the relationship. And they have less relationship satisfaction. So this is the career versus family trade-off. It looks super confusing because as researchers, we like to make things look super important. But like, this stuff is usually pretty easily explainable. So then y'all notice that when I messed up this whole metric, I split the ends, right, into 6 different ones. That's because these each have their own subscales and they measure different things. One of them measures power, one of them measures gender differentiation, and one of them measures heterosexuality. So the first one we have is protective paternalism. Under hostile sexism, protective paternalism is the belief that women should be controlled by men. It's based on the idea that women are not fully competent adults and they can't make decisions for themselves. Think about abortion laws. We're doing this to protect women. We're doing this for their own good. And because, men should be able to control women and make decisions for them. Protective paternalism, that's under benevolent sexism. Right? This protective paternalism is based on that men's dependence on women as wives, romantic objects and mothers who should be loved. They should be cherished and revered and put on that pedestal and protected by men. Every man should have a woman that he loves and adores, right? It emphasizes men's protection or men's affection and their drive to protect those women, but only the good women, and only because women are weaker and in need of guidance, right? Then we have competitive gender differentiation. This is the social justification for men's structural power. The differentiation emphasizes the belief that only men are capable of governing social institutions. This includes politics, but it also includes the church, right? Men are the ones that are the leaders and supposed to be at top. It leads to a downward comparison between men and women. Women can't do it because they're incompetent. If you ever see conversations online and you hear things like, well, men built the world, you wouldn't have this world without men. That's competitive gender differentiation. That's men saying, because you're not grateful enough for the things that we gave you, now we're going to do competitive gender differentiation and talk down towards you. Compared to complementary gender differentiation, which is what's taught in a lot of churches, right? This is based on a codependency between men and women. You complete each other, right? Men and women complete each other. They're made for each other. It justifies those traditional gender roles. Women are just better at some things than men. Men are just better at some things than women. So in that way, we complement each other and we go together. And that's also why being LGBTQ isn't right, because you don't have that complementarianism, right? This role also tends to paint men in a bad light. A lot of the pushback that I get from people is, well, men are disproportionately, they don't get custody of their children, right? Women get custody more. Well, why do we think that is? That's based on misogyny. It's based on the idea that women are the caregivers. Men are the protectors and providers. They're not supposed to be caregiving for the kids. Well, that plays out in our court system too. So then we go to court and judges look at this and they say, well, women are the caregivers, right? So they tend to get custody more. That's a whole other presentation as well, y'all. But that's also how this stuff can come back and bite at men. Patriarchy hurts all of us, right? It paints men into these boxes in these corners too. Tells us that women are the emotional ones and men can't express emotion, right? And then we end up with all these other issues in our society. And then we have hostile intimacy and heterosexual intimacy. I really wish we would change this into hostile heterosexuality, because I feel like hostile intimacy is an oxymoron. But we also have like 30 years of research that they won't let me just like wipe out and redo things on. So I would really rather call this hostile heterosexuality. But it's the perception of women as merely sexual objects. This occurs when you're told that your body is a temptation for men, that it causes men problems, that you're a stumbling block, that it's a threat, and that if you aren't good enough to land in that benevolent sexism category, then the hostile sexism category is just out of reach. It's coming for you. And it'll call you a slut and a whore. It'll call you a stumbling block, right? If you don't dress modestly enough, if you flirted with that guy after church, if you talk to that guy for like just a little bit too long, right? That hostile sexism and that hostile heterosexuality will come back in. In here, we also find the idea that women are dangerous and their they can use their sexual attraction to control men, manipulate men, those seductresses, right? It's really funny how women are these innocent creatures, right? Except when they're not. And you can not be an innocent creature and not even realize it, apparently. So notice that ambivalence again, right? It hovers back and forth. And then we have heterosexual intimacy. That's the romanticized view of women in terms of sexuality. They're pure, they're on a pedestal, but this also places women as trophies or objects to be won, right? Rather than whole people with complex lives and likes and dislikes and preferences, including preferences in sex, y'all. I'm a sex therapist. Do you have any idea how many couples come in and they're struggling with sex because they're following this pre-prescribed script of like, man acts this way, woman acts this way, men like this, women like this. And they don't even realize that they're operating on the script. And then you're like, hey, you can like whatever you want in sex. And not only that, but you can tell your partner about it. And they're like, do they want to know about it? I don't even think they want to know about it, because purity culture told me that I'm just supposed to essentially act this certain way during sex, right? Sex is a prescribed activity. And usually for women in purity culture, you're taught that sex is something done to you, not with you, right? Men take sex from you, you give it. Notice how that's not a participatory event, right? So here's these metrics again. If y'all wanted to see them piled up next to each other, this is how we usually present them in research, is right next to each other. And here's those pyramids I promised you about. This is my last slide. So if y'all have any questions, gave you about 5 minutes to answer them, but I did tell Janice that I would hang out and answer any questions that anyone had. But I want you to notice on these pyramids how much this stuff overlaps. And I want you to notice the violations of benevolent sexism, right? We have these sexist attitudes. We have hymen myths. We have slut shaming. It's when you're not a good enough woman, right? This stuff is hostile sexism. They occur due to a violation, you not being modest enough, you not being quiet enough. And then we deploy hostile sexism. And you'll notice normalization of the things on the bottom allows the things at the top when we slowly build up. There's a lot of crossover between rape culture and purity culture. And there's a reason that these pyramids look so much alike, right? We did that on purpose because we want people to see these overlaps. I think I have a couple questions. So the first, can I just read them out loud in the chat, Janice? Okay. What would you call it when an active reformer, plain dressing Amish women are looked at and desired for sexual encounters and even get demanded that we have to dress in our plain garb for sexual time? So it depends on what attitude is being deployed, right? But that's benevolent sexism. In order to be a good woman, you have to fit these pre-prescribed kind of points, right? You have to dress this way. You have to act this way. You have to be this way, right? So if you're not that, then you're not fulfilling your role. And hostile sexism can be deployed to put you back in line, right? You're shamed for not acting that way. You're shamed for acting out of the role. So benevolent sexism will reward you for staying in that role. And hostile sexism will punish you when you try to step outside of it. And if there's more questions off that, like by all means, keep asking. Something that I get asked often is, can misogyny be used against men? And the way that I say it is, it really just depends on what's being said and what's being deployed. When we demean a man by demeaning the feminine, when we call him a fag, when we call him a pussy, we are deploying misogyny to feminize that man and degrade him. When we're telling the man, don't act like that, that doesn't make you a man, don't cry, we're deploying toxic masculinity principles, right? When we say you're a bitch because you cry, we're deploying misogyny. So it's a super nuanced discussion. And sometimes I can't even answer it for my students. They're like, well, what about this? And what about, it gets super nuanced, right? And there's layers to it. So this person said it's also accompanied by the fact that you're supposed to be demure, pure homemaker. Those are all benevolent sexism characteristics, right? Those are all characteristics that would make you a good, pure woman, right? So how do we deconstruct this? Oh, y'all, I have so many books. Oh my gosh. So Mona out the hallway, I will put her in the chat. She's absolutely incredible. I might spell her name a little wrong, but I don't think I am. She's incredible. Bell Hooks is also absolutely incredible. If you can find any books by Bell Hooks, absolutely do. TikTok and social media are fantastic for this, y'all. If you look up Unpacking the Patriarchy or hashtag Smash the Patriarchy, you will definitely find it in there. I will put my social media in here. I am a raging feminist. Please don't hate me. I I'm on TikTok and Instagram, and I talk about this stuff a lot.
There was one comment.
Go ahead.
It sounds like I'm echoing. Up near when we first started, someone said primatologist Dr. Franz de Waal has a great book titled Different. Much of the nature behavior of men and women comes from our evolved nature. Male/female behavior is so similar to that of the other apes that it can't be purely culturally learned. We need to understand it, not deny it.
So I would suggest reading, that's a fine book, but Sex at Dawn is also an absolutely fantastic book that will go over this. And they talk heavily about bonobos and our social interactions. That's a whole other topic that I do, y'all. That's a whole other lecture. There's a wonderful book called Testosterone Rex that talks about how we blame testosterone a lot for men's behavior and how it's been used as a scapegoat. So the idea of hormones has really been used a whole bunch as a scapegoat. And it's one of those things where we definitely know biology influences behavior, right? What we are also, and I mentioned this at the very beginning, what we're also finding now though, for example, women have certain areas of the brain usually that are more developed for things like cooperation. And again, I can't get super into this. It's a whole other thing, but things like cooperation, sociability. What we've actually found is that what we know is the more you use it, the higher the connections, right? The more neural connections you have, the deeper your grooves, just like playing the piano, those connections will get stronger. Well, because we socialize women to be so cooperative and be so nice, those connections get stronger. So we're actually finding that the way that we socialize genders changes our brain structure, literally, and we can see it in an fMRI. So we're really going back and unpacking a whole bunch of this stuff and a whole bunch of these assumptions. We're looking at testosterone. We're looking at the influence of hormones. Gender diverse folks are actually giving us some really great data and research on that, right? So that's a wonderful thing. We're still lacking research. I know this comes as a shock to absolutely everybody, but they don't want to fund clinical sexology research. When you go to a research board and you say, I research sex for a living, they're like, what? So we can get it done, right? But it's slow. It's a slow movement. If anyone wants to study the apes that we're closest to, bonobos are it. Sex at Dawn is an absolutely fantastic book. I highly recommend that. Awesome. It talks a lot about that kind of stuff.
I'm sorry to say that we have come to the end of our time. This has just been a fantastic session. I know people will be hoping that they can access your slides. I don't know. Hopefully you'll be willing to share those with us. Sue can work with you to make sure that happens if you're comfortable with that. This was wonderful. I'm so grateful to my daughter for recommending you as a speaker because, I feel like I learned so much. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Dr. Kramer.